All right, good evening. My name is Corliss Jackson, and we are going to talk today about cracking the code to your federal job search. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, I have about 20 years of federal HR experience. I started at the Department of Health and Human Services and then moved over to the Office of Personnel Management. I left my job there. I was a GS-15 program manager. And I left there about 9 years ago to spend a little bit more time with my girls at home. And several people approached me and said, I would love to work for the federal government. I've got skill, I've got talent, I've got accomplishments under my belt, I've got what it takes to make a great public servant. However, I cannot understand this hiring process. Can you please help me? And if we fast forward through to today, what we do at Federal Job Results is help people with changing careers into the federal government, transitioning into the federal government. We work with those who are in the military, those who are in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, and those who might be unemployed looking for employment with the federal government. So what we're going to do today is go over a number of different things, and we're going to start with the next slide. We're going to start with going over what we call the Federal Job Roadmap. Now, in order to understand from an insider's perspective what is going on in the government in terms of hiring, we really need to understand what it looks like when you submit an application and where that application goes and what they're doing with it. Some of you think you've entered your information into a black hole. Many of you may think that, in fact. The truth is that there's an actual process, and it's backed by regulations. And we just want to make sure that you understand what is actually happening, because if you can understand what they're doing with your application and why, it really can help you prepare a better application package. The second thing we're going to talk about is what I call the puzzle. These are the regulations that back up federal hiring. This is what they're looking for in your package, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Third thing we're going to touch on is the difference between a federal and a private sector resume. Big difference in the types of information and the length of the resumes, and we'll compare and contrast the two types of documents. And lastly, we'll talk about USAJOBS.gov, which is probably the most popular website for identifying and applying to federal jobs, but there are others, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, let's talk about the Federal Job Roadmap. You will probably apply using some kind of electronic software, probably USAJOBS, but as I just stated, there are other websites where you can find federal employment. USAJOBS has about 99% of the jobs that are out there are advertised on USAJOBS.gov, but there are agencies that do not advertise on USAJOBS.gov. They are not required to. There are probably about 20-25 agencies that have their own separate websites. At the end of the session today, I will share with you some information about my website. And if you go to my website and you look under Federal Career Resources, you will see a section that lists the agencies that have separate career pages with their job vacancy announcements on them. Jobs that are not in USAJOBS.gov. Okay? The bottom line is that you will probably apply electronically, and the HR folks will collect your application materials, and they will rate and rank those application materials. Now, they're looking primarily for three main things. Number one, they're looking at how you respond to what we call the Self-Assessment Questionnaire. This is that multiple choice questionnaire where you're asked anywhere from 10 to 150 questions, and generally the responses have to be either A, B, C, D, or E. And many of you know what I'm talking about. This process is done by a computer. It's an electronic process. And as an applicant, your goal is to answer at the very highest possible level. Usually it's something like E, I'm an expert. A usually says, I don't know anything. B, I know a little bit. C, I know more than a little bit. D, I'm okay. And E, I'm an expert. And you need to answer at the highest possible level that you can squeeze out, market yourself, brag about yourself, boast about yourself and your skills, because the computer is going to decide whether or not you go through the process or whether or not you're going to be done with the process at this point. The highest level that you can possibly respond at is the level that you need to respond at. Now, the second thing that the HR folks are looking for are keywords. And keywords are very important, both in the private sector process and in the federal sector process. An HR representative will actually scan your resume with human being eyeballs looking for keywords. You want to make sure these keywords stand out. One of the things we like to do is to use capital letters for keywords. We will capitalize the entire word or phrase that needs to be highlighted in a resume. Now, the third thing that the HR folks are looking for is a federal resume, which I told you earlier is very different than a private sector resume. So there's three main things that are happening as your application is getting rated and ranked. Number one, they're looking at the responses to your self-assessment questionnaire, and that's done electronically. Number two, the HR folks are looking for keywords. And number three, the HR folks are looking for your federal resume. Now, they are looking to put you into one of three categories. First category is not qualified. That is not a good place to be. Means for that particular application, you will not move forward. The second category is called eligible but not referred. And it's very common, very common. Means you're applying to the right types of jobs, but your resume can't support the applications you're submitting, and they're not approving you for those types of jobs. Very common. The third category is called best qualified. And what that means is that out of these three tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the folks who are at tier 3 will move forward in the process. Tier 1 and tier 2 do not move forward. So if you find yourself in tier 2, which is called best qualified, you will be what we call referred to the hiring manager, meaning you will move forward in the process and you will move out of the HR arena and into the program area where the hiring manager actually does the hiring and where the work is actually performed. So at this point, Human Resources is done with their assessment of your application, and they have decided that there are several applicants, probably somewhere between 10 and 30 applicants, who will move forward in the process. Now, once you are what we call referred, the hiring manager will decide whether or not to interview you. He or she will generally get a stack of somewhere between 10 and 30 applications, and they will generally interview somewhere between 5 and maybe up to 15 or so candidates. Pretty competitive process. So you want to make sure that as an applicant you are well prepared for your federal interview. Do your research. Find out what the agency does, how they're funded, what their strategic planning documents say for the next 1 year, for the next 5 years. And very importantly, find out who is going to be sitting on your interview panel. What do I mean by that? You will generally be interviewed by somewhere between 3 and 5 individuals who may be hiring managers. They might be colleagues who would work with you. They might be customers of the organization, might be people from Human Resources. The bottom line is that you're going to have to answer to probably 3 to 5 individuals throughout the course of your interview. One of the best things you can do for yourself is to ask the person who extended the interview to you to tell you who is going to be on your panel. If they've scheduled the date, the time, the location, they probably know who's going to be there to meet with you. It's your job to ask. Now, once you get that information, it's your job to do the research. Use social media, use the internet, see what you can find out about these individuals. The more rapport that you can build in the interview, the more likely they are to be interested in you as a candidate. It's very important that in that 60 to 90 minutes, you do as much as you can to show that you have the skills to do the job, but also that you can build rapport as an individual with other people. Super, super important. Do your research. If you know that you're not a good interviewee, practice. Practice in front of a mirror. Practice with your cell phone. Practice. There's nothing better that you can do for yourself. If you can't ace the interview, you will never get a job offer. So it's important that you figure out how to ace this. Get coaching, read a book, find someone to do a mock interview with and give you feedback. Super important. All right, so you get through that interview and they decide that they absolutely love you and they have to have you on staff. They will generally, they being the hiring official, will generally pass your information back to the HR office to make you a job offer. The first time you are entering into federal civilian employment is the only time that you can negotiate salary. You cannot negotiate your grade level, but you can negotiate your step level. Let me explain. In the federal government, the most common pay plan is called the GS series. Starts at a GS1 and goes up to a GS15. Every level is divided into 10 different sections. Step 1, which is the section number 1, the lowest level, is the lowest salary, and that is where the HR folks will make you an offer. They will always offer you the step 1 of the grade that you're applying to. You can negotiate up to the step 10. The difference between the step 1 and step 10 can be anywhere from $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, so or more. So it makes sense if you're entering federal employment for the first time. It makes sense for you to negotiate salary. The other thing that you may want to negotiate or look at is your leave category. You can negotiate your leave category. The first time you enter into federal employment, you will be offered the leave category where you would accrue 4 hours per pay period. You can negotiate that up to 6 or even up to 8 hours per pay period. But the only time you can do that is when you first start with the government. Once you're in there and you're doing the work and you're in the system, there's no negotiating that happens. So make sure that you know that you take care of that and that you know about that up front so that if this is something that's an option, the agency has the money and they're interested in doing that, they're interested in you, it's something that you can definitely pursue. All right, so let's talk about the regulations surrounding federal hiring. 2 ways for you to qualify for most federal positions, and both of these methods involve a certain amount of time for you to be either on the job or doing something very similar. Let me explain. First way to qualify for federal employment is by using something we call direct work experience, meaning you look in USAJOBS or a similar system and you see a position that looks very much like one that you've performed, and you've performed that work for at least 1 year or 12 months, and that's the minimum amount of time. The 12 months does not need to be consecutive. 12 months does not need to be consecutive. It does need to be 12 months in total. They're very particular about that. Now, some of you may find that in USAJOBS, you don't see a job that is that similar to something that you've done. And that's when we have to use something we call transferable skills. Those are the skills that we've gained in some environment. We all have them. Doesn't matter where we gain them, but we're applying them to our next position, in this case in the federal government. So it's super important that you understand what transferable skills are. Let me give you my favorite example. I was working with a store owner, store manager in the area, and she wanted a job in the government. Now you might think that a store manager might not qualify for federal employment, but when you look at the types of things that she did in her work, it's very clear that she would qualify for a federal government job. So things like managing people, dealing with human resources issues, dealing with inventory, budgeting and finance, dealing with customers, customer service, communicating with customers, dealing with vendors and contractors, and accounts receivable and accounts payable, and all of the stuff that goes along with managing a store. Really, there's a lot of skills there that we could utilize in the federal government. So when we build your federal resume and we think about the application package you're submitting, you really want to think about what is it that the target organization needs, and how can I pull that information out of my past history and align that past history with something that the organization needs. So what we did is we looked at the store manager's resume, and instead of building a store manager resume, we built a resume that was focused around those skills that I mentioned earlier that the federal government would be very interested in. This lady is now working for the federal government as an analyst. So she went from store manager to analyst using what we call transferable skills. Now the good thing is that we all have transferable skills. The challenge is figuring out exactly what they are and figuring out how to utilize them in a way that leverages your experience towards your job target. So sometimes you have to dig really deep, but it's super important that you know what transferable skills are and figure out how you can use them in your favor. All right, the second thing I want to talk about is knowledge, skill, and ability statements. Knowledge, skill, and ability statements. These are called KSAs, and some of you might have heard of this acronym before. KSAs are short statements that the government gives us that they want us to prove, meaning the burden of proof is on us as applicants. Now, in the past, the way that we had to prove these KSA statements was in the form of a lengthy essay, somewhere around 1 or 2 pages for each KSA statement. And there were usually between 4 and 8 per job announcement. So it became a really lengthy process with a lot of writing. My first federal application was 21 pages long, and 16 of those pages were KSAs that I had written in an essay format. The most popular or most common KSA is probably ability to communicate orally and in writing. And you've probably seen that on 1 or more announcements. What they're trying to get at is they want to see your communication skills documented on your resume. Meaning if it says in the announcement, ability to communicate orally and in writing, somewhere in your resume, you need to make sure that you have listed your communication skills and in what capacity you've communicated and to whom. It's very important. So you're off the hook in terms of writing an essay, but you still need to incorporate these KSA statements into your resume, into the body of your resume itself. Now, as you start looking at jobs that are similar, and we're going to talk about how to identify target jobs on the next slide, but as you start looking at jobs that are similar, you should see that these KSA statements start to look alike, meaning similar KSAs for similar types of jobs. And that's actually a good thing, because once you build your resume and you build a foundational resume, oftentimes you don't have to add much information to it to apply to different jobs. All right, so let's look at an actual announcement, and we're going to talk a little bit here about how to identify which jobs you should be applying for. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how the federal government structures its jobs. All right, now if you look over here on the Overview tab, you will see a lot of good information, including salary and duty location, so we know how long we're going to have to commute. But really importantly, I want you to spend some time looking right here. Okay, very important part of the announcement. It's called Series and Grade, and this is where the job series and the grade appears. Now, this 4-digit number, 0343 in this case, is called the job series number. And what we do in the government is we group together similar jobs, and we give them job titles like secretary, program manager, etc. And we also group them into categories, overarching categories. Now, across the federal government, there are 23 overarching categories under which all jobs fall. Now, across the government, there's probably about 400 different subcategories into which all federal jobs fall. Now, if you are working in a particular agency, in a particular state, in a particular country, and you have a buddy who is doing the same work and is in the same job series, but working with a different agency, in a different state, in a different country, as long as you share job series and you're in the same job series, you are primarily doing the same type of work. So it's just a way for us to categorize the jobs across the federal government. Now, let me show you how this works. All right, this is a list of the 23 occupational groups that I mentioned earlier. These are the umbrella groups under which all jobs fall across the government. Here's how this chart works. If you have supported or managed a program, project, or process in any capacity, you will fall into what we call the General Administrative, Clerical, and Office Services group. Meaning if you have supported or managed a program, project, or process, this is going to be the category that's the fit for you. Now, this is where we include project manager, program manager, special assistant, executive officer, administrative officer, secretary, mail clerk, office manager. All of the administrative, clerical, and management of programs or projects is done under this particular category. Meaning, if you know that you have this experience and you've done this particular type of work for at least 12 months, you can start doing some searches in USAJOBS that will allow you to select jobs that are in this 0300 family. Okay? Now, if you have done work that is what I'll call subject matter expertise, for me it would be human resources. For you it might be math or logistics or IT. You would then find yourself in another occupational group. Okay? So let me show you how this works. For me, Corliss, I'm going to fall into the 0200 group for human resources because I have at least 12 months worth of experience under my belt. And I also have been a program manager. So I'm going to also fall into the 0300 group. These are the only two groups that make any sense for me because I don't have 12 months of experience doing IT or transportation or supply or quality assurance. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now, one of the benefits of knowing this information is that you can now go into USAJOBS, and there is a section in USAJOBS called Search Jobs. And under the Save Jobs tab, there's a tab called Save Jobs. You can actually search for and save your search under an occupational group, meaning I can go in and search just for jobs that are in Washington, D.C., that are in the 0200 occupational group, and I can select salary, I can select location, I can make a lot of different criteria that applies to me come forth in that search, and then save that search daily. Save it as a daily search, and the system will actually push jobs to you through your email of jobs that are in a particular group or family. Okay? Now, how do you know which occupational group is right for you? This is the second tab in the vacancy announcement. It's called the Duties tab. Okay? And you will see here anywhere from 6 to 8 separate either sections or bullets of text. Here we have, I think we have 6 here. Okay? Now, each one of these sections represents a core skill that the HR people are looking for. And this is super important. This is where the rubber hits the road. You need to figure out, by looking at these separate 6 to 8 bullets and focusing primarily on the verbs, you need to figure out if you've done about 80% of what they're looking for. Okay? Meaning, have you done 6 or 7 of these 7 or 8 bullets? And we're looking primarily at the verbs. Okay? Why are we looking at the verbs? Because I don't really care where you've managed staff. You might have done it in a store. You might do it for the federal government. If you can manage staff in Organization A, you can probably manage staff in Organization B. So the location of where you've done the work is less important to me than the work activity that you've engaged in. So it's super important for me to see that you've done the verbs, and less important is the location in which you've performed that work. So we're looking primarily for verbs. Okay? And you're looking, like I said, for an 80% match. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that as you are looking at this list, you will find that those things that are most important to the HR people and are weighted the most will be at the top of this list. And the things that are least important and weighted the least will be at the bottom of the list. So there's actually a progression from most important to least important. And these are actually weighted. So you want to keep that in mind as you're deciding whether or not you've done 80% of what they're looking for. All right. Now, once you have decided that you've done 80% of what the HR folks have listed in the duties section, I would go back to the front page of the announcement and take a look at the 4-digit number or job series code that's listed on the front of the announcement. You can actually do searches under this particular job series number, and as we stated earlier, you can do searches in USAJOBS on a particular occupational group or family. So the 0343 in this particular case is just a subheading of the 0300 occupational group. So you can run searches on either the occupational group or, more specifically, the job series. Now, it's very probable that once you have identified a job series, that there are multiple jobs in that job series that will make sense for you. Why? Because if you have program analyst skills and you have the skills to do that particular job, you probably have the skills to do another program analyst job that is similar in grade level. So it's important to start identifying which job series you're most closely aligned with. And usually people will have somewhere around 4, maybe a handful of job series that are a good fit, and probably 2 of those overarching occupational groups. All right, so let's talk about the federal resume and really pinpoint the differences between a corporate or private sector resume and a federal resume. Very different documents. Private sector or corporate resume is probably the one that most of you are familiar with. It's generally very short, 1 to 2 pages max, and the focus generally is on accomplishments or results. So you'll find that there's generally a lot of bullets, and we like to use metrics and count how many widgets, how many people, how many dollars, and add that to our resume because it makes us look good, frankly. Now, a federal resume, on the other hand, is completely opposite. A federal resume, in most cases, will be somewhere around 5 pages long. If you are in the military or you have extensive experience in a certain area, you may find that the length of your federal resume goes up to around 7 pages. Very detailed, very lengthy. Now, there's a reason why we have this length. The HR people are actually comparing your federal resume to the regulations, and they have a document called a crediting plan. And they're comparing your federal resume to their crediting plan. Every announcement has a different crediting plan. The crediting plan is related to the duties of the job. Now, what the HR people will do is they'll compare your federal resume with their crediting plan, and when they see information in your resume that matches with their crediting plan, they will give you credit for having that information in your resume. That's why it's called a crediting plan. The more information you have in your resume that matches with their crediting plan, the higher GS level you will qualify for. So it's super important in order to qualify for federal employment to have significant detail in your federal resume so that you can match your experience and your past history with the job that you are targeting. Now, the other thing that is a little bit different about a federal resume is the focus of a federal resume, meaning what is it that the HR people are looking for? What actually interests them? The HR folks are very interested in how you accomplished your results. The fact that you saved a company millions of dollars or that you saved somebody's life is really important to them, but they're most interested in the process that you engaged in to get to that accomplishment. Now that's the HR people, that first step in the process. The hiring manager, on the other hand, is extremely interested in finding out what can you do for him or her, meaning how can you make me look good? Because employees, our job really is to make our managers and our supervisors look good. So the hiring manager wants to see those results and accomplishments. The challenge is that as applicants, we only get one chance to submit one resume through the process. So our federal resume has to meet the HR requirements, the process, the skills, how did I do the work. And we have to make sure we have enough results on our resume or enough accomplishments on our resume to make the hiring manager a little bit interested in our experience so that we can get a phone call for an interview. So the HR folks need to know how you perform the work, and there's a lot of detail associated with that, and the hiring manager needs to know what you did. And because we get one shot, one federal resume, we have to incorporate both of these aspects. And it's a very delicate balance between how to have enough information for human resources and how to have the results that the hiring managers are looking for. It's a balance. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about this. All right, there's several different ways to write a resume, and everybody you ask will probably have a different, will have different advice for you, different viewpoints. But I'm just going to give you some items that you might want to think about as you're writing your federal resume, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we do those things, because I think that's important. First thing I want to talk about is the fact that your federal resume should be chronological. And what we mean by that is that you go backwards from today, where the latest employment is at the top of your resume, and we generally will go back 10 years. Okay? Now, some of you may need to go back further, and that is okay. Keep in mind the HR people only really need to see about 10 years, and they're mostly interested in seeing where your most senior employment is or was for the job you're targeting. What do I mean by that? If you've been, let me give you a military example. If you've been in the military for 20 years, generally you've moved through the system, and the position that you're in right now, or the position that you just left, is generally your most senior position. The HR people need to see if you've been in that role for at least 12 months. Okay? Most people's most senior employment is closest to today and is closest to the top of your resume. And that's if you do your resume chronologically. If for some reason your most senior or your most relevant experience happened before 2005, you may have to resituate your resume so that your most senior and most relevant experience can be highlighted more towards the top of your resume, and your less relevant experience can be, the focus can be taken off your less relevant experience. Remember, this is your resume, and it's your opportunity to put this resume in a format that makes sense for you and shows how great you are. So if you need to de-emphasize something, you have a gap in your employment, you for whatever reason you stayed home to take care of mom and dad or little Johnny and Susie, that is absolutely okay. Make sure that you're putting your best foot forward in that federal resume. You have an opportunity to make some good choices here. You can go back further than 10 years, and I would only do that if you need to. Once you go past the 2005 mark, You do not have to list the actual dates of when you did something. For example, let's say you were a communications contractor with the White House Communications Office, and you were there for 7 years. They don't need to know, they being the HR people, do not need to know that this experience happened in the early 1900s. They don't need you to put 1928 to 1933. What they need to know is that you have 5 years or 7 years of experience doing certain work. So you can state what you've done, and you can say that you've done that for 7 years. You don't have to date yourself in your federal resume. Pull out what you need to pull out and highlight it, and de-emphasize what you want to de-emphasize. The government does not ask you what percentage of time you've done certain types of things. So it won't really matter if you want to highlight something in a brighter light, or if you want to de-emphasize something. It's totally up to you because it's your resume. All right, repetition is good, meaning if you've done a particular job and you've done the same job but maybe for multiple companies, you do want to list the details of what you've done over and over again under each job entry. Repetition is good. You'll get more credit, and you'll get you'll basically get a higher grade level. You'll qualify for a higher grade level by putting the information in your resume multiple times. Repetition is not a bad thing in the federal government. All right, details. We know we need details for the HR folks, and we know that we need accomplishments for the hiring manager. Super important if you want to get through those few hurdles in the human resources arena, and then you want to get a phone call from the hiring manager for an interview. You have to include both. Now, generally what we do at Federal Job Results is we will build your chronological resume using the core skills from the duties announcement, from the duty section of the vacancy announcement. So look at the duty section as you're building your federal resume to see exactly what types of information you need to put into your resume. The duty section from the job announcement in the job series that you think you're best suited for. So let's talk about USAJOBS for a moment. And one of the things that I just love about USAJOBS is that it keeps a great track record of everything that you've applied to if you go to USAJOBS first while you're applying, meaning use it as your hub for your job search and for your applications, and it will track all of your applications for you. Now, there's two ways for you to actually get your resume into the USAJOBS system so that you can actually apply to jobs. I will recommend that you use the usajobs.gov resume builder. You will find that there's also a way that you can browse, attach, and upload your resume, but I'm going to recommend that you use the builder primarily for three main reasons. Number one, it's easy for the HR people to find the information because they're familiar with how the resume builder operates and where the information is. Number two, most of these systems, these are secondary systems. Application Manager, Monster, AView, these are secondary systems that actually collect your application materials. And if you use the USAJOBS resume builder, most often your application will filter through to these systems. Not all the time, but the majority of the time. The third reason I like to use the USAJOBS Resume Builder is because it prompts you for all of the information required on a federal resume. And we have a lot of different types of information that we want to see that isn't necessarily asked for on the private sector resume. So things like the month that you started working, the month that you stopped working, and we want the street address of where you worked. Sometimes we'll require, but not always, supervisor name, salary. So these are things that usually aren't asked for in a private sector resume, but they are asked for in a federal resume. Let's talk about this for a moment. Salary is one of those fields that is optional, totally optional. So if you are not interested in sharing your salary, as long as the announcement does not say that it is required, you do not have to share your salary information. The other thing that I get a lot of questions about is the supervisor information. The federal government will want to talk to a former employer of yours just to verify that you were working at that location and that your resume is correct. And they will give you several options as you put in your information into the resume builder. They will ask you, may we contact your current supervisor? And the answer is yes, no, or contact me first. If your current supervisor does not know you are looking for a federal government job and you do not want him or her to know, you do not need to say yes. You can say contact me first. And that's probably the best option for you. Meaning they will, after the interview and after they decide that they love you and that they want to hire you, they will generally go back to you and ask you if it's okay for them to check in with your supervisor. Okay, and they will generally do that after you've been to the interview. The other jobs that you've held that are not your current that are not with your current supervisor, meaning your past jobs, if at all possible, I would say yes, contact my supervisor. Now, if there's some reason why you don't want that to happen, what I would do is to select contact me first, and then I would go through a conversation with the HR folks and have that conversation talking about the situation that you were in and what happened, just so that you can tell your side of the story before your former employer tells their side of the story. And believe me, every HR person knows that there's two sides to every story. So it's not it's not a bad thing to say contact me first. It will raise a red flag if you have a bunch of no's. No, don't contact my supervisor. No, don't contact my supervisor. That will raise some red flags. All right, the other thing I want to talk about in terms of USAJOBS is that there is a lot of capability for you to do some really powerful searches in USAJOBS. And we will actually have a webinar about using USAJOBS in the near future. But one of the things I just want to point out to you, once you've set up your profile in USAJOBS, which you would do similar to any website that you would visit and you want to do business with them, shopping or anything else, you will find that when you set up your searches, if you've set up your profile correctly, your searches, once you're logged into USAJOBS, should come back with all of the criteria that make sense for you based on your profile. So if you're in the military, you should get responses back that show that you can apply to jobs that are for people who are in the service or who separated from the service. So make sure that your profile is set up correctly. The other thing is under on the left side of your screen in USAJOBS, you will also find something called Save Searches. And this is where you can set up your occupational group or family, your job series, your location, salary, level, and you can set all that information up under save searches, and you can actually save up to 10 searches that will be emailed to you daily. So if you're interested in getting those jobs pushed to you through email, that's a great way to make sure you're not missing out on anything. All right, so wrapping up here, apply to jobs with less competition. There are different types of jobs in the government, and in USAJOBS, under the keyword search box, you can actually search for temporary jobs using the term temp, or term appointments using the term term. And these are both non-permanent federal appointments. Sometimes they have different benefits packages, so you have to look out for that. But a lot of times they're easier for you to get into than permanent positions. Once you're in the system, it's a lot easier to get to know people, to know who's holding the purse strings, to figure out who's hiring, and to move yourself around to a permanent position. So try temp and term positions. Also, look at direct hire positions. These are positions that the government is desperate for, and they don't have enough people coming down the pike, and they need to hire immediately. Generally, you'll find the positions that are under direct hire to be contract specialist positions, where these folks are managing contracts for the government. Also, information security under the IT umbrella. And sometimes you'll find other types of positions under direct hire, but those are the major ones. The other thing that I will tell my clients to do is look at jobs that maybe aren't in the metropolitan area, jobs where public transportation does not go, because there are some people who will not apply to jobs if public transportation doesn't go. And if you look at the exterior of most metropolitan areas, and I'll take Washington, D.C. as an example, you will find jobs all the way around the Beltway outside of the perimeter of the metropolitan area. So Chantilly, Manassas, Quantico, Fort Meade, you'll find jobs that are federal positions, but they're not necessarily in the metropolitan area. It's a great way to focus your search on jobs that maybe will have less competition. Okay? Once you're in the government for a year, 12 months, and you've met your probationary period, and that's with a regular appointment, you will find that it's a lot easier to move around and move about. Find committees to meet people and find people who are hiring and intern programs and all kinds of neat things. But it's a lot easier once you're in to move around the government. All right, lastly, you do have to be consistent and persistent, meaning it might take 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 applications before you start getting referrals. You may find that all of your referrals don't necessarily result in an interview. In fact, it's going to be a fraction of those referrals. So the more applications, the more numerous your applications are, the more applications you submit, the better off you're going to be in the long run. It's a very, very competitive process. All right, so I am, at this point, I'm going to take a couple questions. And first question is, what if your supervisor is no longer at the job that you're listing as a past employer on your resume? And I would tell you to list the company name, list the supervisor's name, and if the company has a main number, I would list the main number of the company. And even if that individual is not there, there will be some record of that person being there, that supervisor being there, and some record of you being a member of his or her staff. So don't put too much thought into it. Let the HR people do as much of the work as they can, and you just make sure that you're putting the correct information on so that you can make their job a little bit easier, but you don't have to do all their job for them. All right, another question. I have a lot of relevant volunteer and internship experience. Should I put these in the employment section? The answer is yes. So any type of experience that you have, volunteer experience, internship, paid work experience, unrelated experience, it all counts if you can, in fact, document it in your resume. Even if you've gone to school or had training, you can document that in the job chronology of your resume, and you can still get credit for the training or the education. For example, let's say you went to college for 2 years and you document that on your resume. That can actually work in your favor because you can get credit under for those 2 years of attending college. All right. Let me see. So if you have only one job in the last 10, 12, 15 years, your resume will probably be on the shorter side, somewhere around 3 pages, because you're only going to need to list that one job that you held. Now, if you were in that job and held different positions in the organization, I would somehow document that in your federal resume to show that you had an increase in responsibility and also that your salary increased with that responsibility increase. All right, so let's talk for a little bit about non-competitive appointments. And this is something that some of you might have heard under Schedule A, which is a disability schedule. And what the government does is that they have allowed people with disabilities and people who are in the military and other groups of people as well to be appointed to certain positions non-competitively, meaning they don't have to go through the competitive process that's outlined by the Office of Personnel Management. Now, in theory, what that means is that if you know of an opening and you fit the bill in terms of your qualifications, you could actually go to that hiring manager, go to that HR office and say, here's my resume, I want a job, and they can say, great, come in on Monday. In practice, the way this works is a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging, where the appointment can still be made, meaning you can walk into a position, but figuring out where the position is, if you're qualified for the position, all of those kind of details are a little bit difficult to figure out. But the way that Schedule A basically works, and you can go to opm.gov/disability and see a little bit more about this, but the way that Schedule A works is if you have a non-service connected disability of any kind, you can go to any physician, eye doctor, physician, family practitioner. You can go to any doctor and get a letter that states that you have a disability, however you can perform the duties of the job. You attach this letter with your application materials to your USAJOBS application, and the agency can actually consider you for non-competitive appointment. Okay? So if you have the qualifications to do the job and you have a disability, it works in your favor. Now, if you are a military veteran, first of all, thank you so much for your service. You will want to go to fedshirevets.gov. It's a website that is very useful, has a lot of information about veterans' preference, about the different programs that the government supports, and it will tell you what documentation you need. And there's so much detail there, I don't need to get into it, but you definitely want to visit fedshirevets.gov. All right, I am going to take a couple more questions. All right, so if you're trying to switch fields, meaning you're trying to get into one type of work after doing another type of work, and in this particular case the question is trying to get into human resources coming from accounting or finance, the way that you can do that best is by using your transferable skills. The challenge is that sometimes, particularly in the human resources field, the government has a different set of rules than the private sector. So oftentimes it's hard to show or document that you have 12 months of experience doing something similar. So human resources isn't a great example, but I will tell you that using your transferable skills and leveraging something you've already done and aligning that with where you're going is key. It's all in how you write your resume and how you document where you've came from and how that aligns with where you're going. All right, yes. Another question here, is LinkedIn used by federal HR folks? Yes. Anything that's out there in the public is public domain. Be careful what's on your Facebook, your LinkedIn, out there on the web. There's a big debate now whether or not they should be able to use that information. Right now it's fair game for them. Okay? All right. Good question here. Does it hurt if you decline to answer the demographic information? It does not hurt. It does not hurt. Oh, let's talk about cover letters. Cover letters are not required in most cases, and I don't recommend that you include them unless the announcement specifically says it is mandatory that you include a cover letter. Usually these are for very few types of positions, types of announcements. The federal government cannot use, or the HR people in the federal government cannot use your cover letter because it doesn't have dates on it, meaning they can't see how long or if you meet the 12-month requirement for a particular skill from your cover letter. So what they do is they take that cover letter off and they throw it in the trash, and they will use your resume only. So it's really a waste of time to spend energy creating a cover letter unless the announcement asks for it. Usually these are for attorney positions or for positions that deal with some kind of writing as part of the duties. All right. Another question here, do you need objective statements for the federal resume? The answer is no, because a federal resume, when you're applying to a job, you have to decide which announcements you're targeting. So the HR people already know that you're applying for a specific position. Okay? They already know that you're applying for, you know, job number ABC123, and you don't really need an objective statement for your resume because they already know that you're applying to that particular job. Every time you apply to a federal job, It is a new experience. You are applying against new people. You're competing against new people, and you are being compared to different criteria. So it's very important that you understand that every position that you apply to is a different ballgame, totally different ballgame. All right. All right, so there's a question here. If you're using education and experience to meet the requirements for a position, do you need to submit a transcript right away? I would definitely, if you're using education in any capacity, I would definitely attach an unofficial transcript. The agency, if you are selected for the position, will probably circle back to you and ask you for an official transcript, but I would definitely attach an unofficial transcript if you're using education at all to qualify for the position. All right, so there's a question here. It says, when you are applying for a particular position and it says you have to have a degree, how can you use that education if you do not have the specialized experience? Okay? Some positions will allow you to use or exchange education for experience. The way this works is that the federal government will give you credit for a GS-5 with a bachelor's degree, GS-9 for a master's degree, I'm sorry, GS-7 for a master's degree, and GS-9 for a PhD or its equivalent. If you have work experience, that work experience can layer on top of those positions and boost you up a notch or two or three. And if you have, how to say this, if you have superior qualifications, meaning you had very high grades or you were in the National Honor Society while you were in school, they can also have you enter in at a higher level. So instead of a GS-5 for a bachelor's degree, you might be able to enter as a GS-7 with a bachelor's degree. Most of us who are entering into the federal government will be able to meet the experience, will be able to meet the level of experience they're looking for simply using work experience. There are many jobs in the government for which a degree is not required. If we look back to that occupational chart, that 0-300 group, where it calls for administrative management positions, and we talked about that earlier, that whole entire occupational group has no degree requirements. So you might find somebody who is running a government-wide program and has a GED because there's no educational requirements beyond high school. All right, take a couple more questions. All right, good question. Timeline questions. Let's talk about time. It generally takes somewhere between 6 to 18 months to land a federal job. Can be a very long-term process. When you apply to a federal job and the job closes, it can take anywhere from a couple hours, couple days, to a couple months or more to not only update your status in USAJOBS, but to even go through all of the applications. Like I said earlier, it depends if there are 50 applications or 5,000 applications. It's going to take a lot longer if there's more applications for them to go through. I have seen where people have applied and a year, maybe 18 months later, an HR person came back to them and said, you applied to this job 18 months ago, are you still interested? We're hiring now. It will depend on the agency, the budget, if Congress has funded them for the year. If we're under a continuing resolution, that's a problem, a challenge for agencies who are trying to understand how much money they have for staffing. There's many different criteria. You will find that people who separate from the federal government will leave at the end of the calendar year or in the beginning of the next calendar year. So they'll separate in December or January. So you will find in the first quarter of the calendar year that there'll be a lot of opportunities that are opening up. Last year, the end of the year is when the continuing resolution, we were under a continuing resolution until mid-December. After December 15th, a lot of things have opened up. A lot of agencies have decided who they're hiring, what positions they're hiring for, and you will find that there's a lot more positions that are coming out on the street now. If you find that there is a small window of opportunity for you to apply, meaning maybe the announcement is open for several days. I know agencies like the Navy are doing 4-day announcements where they're only open for 4 days. In the past, this generally meant that they already had qualified applicants. They were advertising the position, and you never know what happens, but in general, they probably had somebody in mind, and they knew that somebody was qualified to do the work. So they didn't need to have the job open very long. Over the last several years, we found that agencies are not interested in going through thousands and thousands of applications, and so oftentimes they will reduce the number of days that an announcement is open, and they are just doing that so that they can manage the number of applications that are submitted. Okay, so in the past probably was a clue if there was a small window of opportunity for you to apply. Nowadays, the HR people are just trying to manage their workload because they're getting thousands and thousands of applications. All right, I'm going to take a couple other questions. One question is about determining, coming in from the outside, determining what salary you should be considering and what grade you would be qualified for. Generally, if you really have no idea what grade level you'd qualify for, what I would do is look at your salary and match it up with the salary chart that you'll find on opm.gov for the metropolitan area that you live in, and just start there. The government isn't as concerned about salary as you think they might be. They're more concerned about whether or not you can do the actual job. And what that's going to entail is a review, a careful review of your resume. They are less interested in the salary that you bring to the table from your previous jobs. And I'll give you myself as an example. I started as a contractor out of graduate school, and I was making about $30,000 a year. And when I moved into the government as a GS-13, I doubled my salary. They didn't look at my past salary and say, well, we can't hire you because you didn't make enough money at that other employer. They looked at my experience and my skills and said, we want to hire this person. So it's more about what you bring to the table and how you can align your skills and experience with meeting their needs. Very, very important. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Senior Executive Service process, and then we'll wrap up for the session today. The Senior Executive Service is one level above the GS pay scale that we talked about. So the GS 1 through 15, above the GS 1 through 15 is something we call the Senior Executive Service. For most agencies, the federal resume is very similar to the one that we discussed if you are applying for the Senior Executive Service, the SES. However, you will need to incorporate the following 5 core competencies into your resume. First one is leading people, leading change, results-driven, business acumen, and building coalitions. And you can find this information at opm.gov/SES. But the Senior Executive Service is a executive management level where the government is expecting you to manage projects, people, processes across the board. So in your resume, you do have to incorporate those 5 ECQs that I mentioned. Most jobs will ask you to submit an essay for each of those executive core qualifications. Some agencies will allow you to submit the resume only, and you will have to do a great job of incorporating your ECQs, or your executive core qualifications, directly into your 5-page SES resume. What does that mean? In the past, you've had somewhere between somewhere between 10 pages of essays and a 5 or more page resume, and you were able to submit that information to the agency. However, in some cases now, the agency only wants to see the 5-page resume. And for some of you, you might think that's great, but for most people, it's really hard to incorporate an entire executive career into 5 pages. It's hard to do. It's challenging. The other thing that many SES positions will ask for is they will ask you for some technical core qualifications. So for example, if the position is related to human resources, they may ask a question about your ability to manage an HR organization. And these are technically related to the position. So as far as senior executive positions, it's a different process, but very similar in terms of how they grade you, how they're scoring you. They're looking for certain things. The more that you have in your resume, the higher score you get. There is a process that you have to go through at the agency level, and then for SES positions that are monitored by the Office of Personnel Management, you will have to get approval through OPM. Once you get that approval, you don't have to seek it again. You got it for the rest of your life, but it can be a challenging process to get to that point. All right, we are going to wrap up. I just want to talk a little bit about what Federal Job Results does. I have some questions here. I want to make sure that I address them. We do work with individuals both on a one-on-one basis, and we do classes. Our next class will be this coming month. It's a boot camp. And what we do is we work with you for a day with about 15 or 20 folks, and this is in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and we will build a resume for your federal job search in one day. It is a process. It does involve work, but most people will leave with a very close to, if not finalized, resume for their federal job search. So if you go to federalJobResults.com, you will click on the link for the boot camp, and you will see when the next boot camp is coming in the metropolitan area. The other thing we do is work with individuals. So if you need more of a partnership with us where we work with you one-on-one, we help you identify the best jobs for your background. We write your federal resume for you. We'll finalize it with you. We coach you through and assist you with the application process. We assist you with the essays that you have to write, if there are any. And we work with you to prepare you for the federal interview and negotiate your salary and leave. That is a separate process. and you can actually go to our website and click on the Contact Us tab, and you will see some information that we ask for from you, and one of us will give you a call or send you an email in the next 48 hours or so, and we can connect if you'd like more information. So on behalf of the staff here at Federal Job Results, we're very glad that you were able to join us, and we look forward to hearing from any of you. If anybody has any questions, please do contact us. We'll be more than happy to reach out to you. Thank you.